So I think we should start. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this panel. My name is Pascal Rogiest. I'm the CEO of LuxTrust, trust services provider established in Luxembourg, in Europe. I'm very pleased to be today the on-the-spot nominated moderator for this session, together with my colleagues here. And we will have a panel about national identity schemes, contrasting different approaches and progress of realizing those national identity schemes. And you will see with the different panelists here that there are definitely different approaches pursued by the different countries, depending on the continent as well. So we will have a lively discussion on debating about those differences in how achieving identity. So before starting, I would like each of the panelists to introduce our ladies first. Joni.
Thank you, Pascal, and thank you for being our on-the-spot moderator. Very appreciated. I'm Joni Brennan. I am the president of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada. DIACC or DIACC is a lot easier to say for short, so we'll accept that as well. We are a non-for-profit association in Canada that is mandated to identify and develop a standard scheme for the Canadian marketplace to advance innovations and to advance a digital ID ecosystem for Canada. I'll also mention that we in Canada see our market as being strong because of our diversity and not in spite of it. So for us in Canada, what's good for us is being international, recognizing international partnerships, working to advance our market in Canada, and doing so with priority toward interoperability for other markets around the world. So we are a standards developing organization as well as a innovation and pilots developing organization for world-class digital identity services.
Hi, I'm Adam Cooper. I'm from the UK government, specifically Government Digital Service, where I'm responsible for the UK government's EID scheme, GovUK Verify, its technical architecture. I'm the lead architect for that. I'm also very heavily involved in many European projects, so I've been involved in the authoring of the legal text, but also the technical specifications for the EIDAS regulation, if anybody is aware of that, which is around interoperability of EID schemes across continental Europe. I'm also involved in many international cooperation agreements as well, and I've just been across the road actually at the Commerce Department working with our friends from NIST, looking at how we can get commonality amongst standards for electronic identity, because that's very important for international trade, which leads on to many of the other interactions I have with identity with the UN, for example. There's a group called UNCITRAL, which is around international trade law, that are heavily considering these things right now. So lots of activity internationally, despite the fact that we have a very national focus, and I'll talk a little bit more about both of those things as we go on, hopefully.
Thank you, Adam.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Alban Féraud, and I'm here as a representative of the Secure Identity Alliance, which actually is an association that gathers many actors of the industry, and actually that mainly aims at supporting states in setting up identity scheme, whether it's a national identity card, passport program, but also digital ID program, and last but not least, population register, which is a basis for trust and identity. And indeed, we are deeply involved in the deployment of digital ID, and we think and we strongly believe that states have a role to play in digital ID to ensure that the identity attributes, the identity information are genuine, which is a basis to set up a digital ID program.
Thanks, Adam.
My name is Jeremy Grant. I'm managing director with the Chertoff Group. We're a firm located just up the road in Washington that focuses on...
No.
All right. Hello. That's much better. I was missing that echo. We'll just share.
Start again.
My name's Jeremy Grant. I'm managing director with the Chertoff Group. We're an advisory firm focused on the security space, located about 3 blocks north of here. On the panel today, I think in part because of what I do today, advising a number of clients around the world on identity schemes, both in physical and the digital space. But also, as we're talking about national identity, the role I played a few years ago, I spent 4.5 years leading the Obama administration's national strategy for trusted identities in cyberspace, which, as we'll talk about today, in models pretty similar to what the UK and Canada have done, has been focused not so much on government as the issuer of identity, but how to leverage the private sector and a marketplace of different accredited solutions that meet common standards for security, privacy, and other important elements.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. I think you can keep the mic, Jeremy, and we are going to start with you. And I mean, a question that we would like to ask you is how do you see the differences in the identity schemes, especially between the US? We will let Joni talk about Canada, but between the US and Europe.
So I think a lot has changed. So let me take you a little bit down memory lane. When the White House launched NSTIC, this was the abbreviation for National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace back in 2011, it was a very radically different approach to digital identity relative to what we'd seen in Europe. In fact, it was nearly impossible in my first year on the job, as I was traveling all around the US and indeed sometimes the world, giving speeches. Almost every time I had to deal with an angry European, very different one every time, but there'd be an angry European who'd be shaking his smart card at me and saying, "Why are you making this so complicated? Why don't you just do this? We do this in our country. It's great." And the answer was really simple. In the US, we don't have a national ID. We do have government-issued IDs, but not ones that are recognized as a formal national ID. And because of the politics, we're simply not going to have one anytime soon. But we still need a digital identity strategy. So we need to do something different. This didn't always mollify the angry Europeans, but it did at least get us to the next point. But I think it does demonstrate a key difference between the US and at least parts of Europe, which is a very different role for what the government does in identity. So our focus in the US was how do you catalyze a marketplace where every American could choose from a variety of different solutions that they could use online that were more secure, more privacy enhancing, easier to use than what they had today. And as I think, again, you'll hear today, the UK has embraced a very similar approach, although they have better accents than us, so it sounds much more sophisticated than what the US has done. And Canada as well. I'm not sure how to describe the Canadian accent. I guess it depends on what region you're in. They do have better gravy for their fries. So I think one thing that's interesting to me, though, talking about the model 6 years ago versus today, is that some things have changed, and I think the lines are starting to blur. So in the US, a lot of the most promising approaches that I'm seeing now with digital identity are really looking at hybrid models that do leverage certain elements of a solution provided by the public sector, generally as an attribute provider to help with the identity proofing side, and then pair it with a credential or an authenticator issued on the private side. In fact, a couple of them have been fueled by successful pilots that came out of the NSTIC program. Probably the most notable one is one that's been led by MorphoTrust, who I think you guys are in the process of buying. So good for you, because it's a great pilot. Oberthur is acquiring all of Morpho globally, assuming the regulators approve, for those who missed that. But they basically took an approach saying, what if we actually let citizens in states where they've already had a robust identity proofing process conducted in person, what if you as a citizen could basically authorize, request that the Department of Motor Vehicle Administrator selectively release a few attributes about you to allow you to engage in a high-risk transaction online that you otherwise would not be able to do. So it's a pilot that rolled out in North Carolina and Georgia. They have now their first paying customer in Alabama. In fact, 2 months ago, the Deputy Commissioner of Revenue in Alabama was up here at the Connect ID conference down the road talking about how they've rolled it out. And basically, if you want to access digital services for around your taxes online, where there's some information that you need to know that it's not the proverbial dog on the internet, you basically have the state, play a role both as an attribute provider as well as a validation of your identity through face recognition match, through a selfie. So I think it's things like that that are kind of interesting. There's another pilot with Yubico where they're leveraging the U.S. Postal Service as part of their identity proofing process. If you're shipping a token to somebody's house, there's a process you go through to validate that there might be somebody who actually lives in that house. Likewise, in Europe, I think you're seeing some hybrid models as well, in part because of mobile, where you might be leveraging, again, the national ID as a root of trust, but then the credential itself or the authenticator might be coming from a commercially provided element. So we can get more into that as the panel goes on.
Okay. So would you say that the two models, the US one and the European one, are converging to a pragmatic use of identities and attributes? And
we're not there yet. I don't think we're going to get there yet. I still think you're going to have countries, particularly looking between the Europe and US, where there's either a definitive role for governments to play in issuing credentials, or there's not. And certainly in the US, I don't see where we've been as a default changing anytime soon. But I do think you'll see progress around the edges where there are business models where you can show that it works for relying parties, it works for issuers, and most importantly, works for the consumer to make their life a little bit easier. And so that's, I think, where you'll see some of those hybrid models. But I do expect to see things be different in the meantime.
Okay. About adopting a pragmatic approach, I would like to let Joni explain what Canada is pursuing with the DIACC. I think it's an interesting combination of pragmatism and efficiency pursued by DIACC in terms of using identity. And you are also at the convergence between the US and not too far from Europe in terms of promixity in politically as well. So, Joni, what is the approach pursued by DIACC in terms of establishing identities and attributes?
Pragmatic and collaborative are two words that are often associated with Canada. Sharing our news and our insights is something that we're working on. So it's a real pleasure to be able to speak here and tell our story in the context of what's happening around the world. And we are a bit in between, and we've adopted a few of the accent qualities like progress and being from our friends in the UK. But in any case, in Canada, if I step back to the instantiation of the DIACC, we all remember the financial meltdown of 2009. In 2010, the Minister of Finance ordered an electronic payments task force review to make sure that the electronic payment system in Canada was providing the best in innovation, privacy, and security for all Canadians. Out of that payments task force review, there was a recognition that Canada needed a digital identity and authentication framework, and that identity is, of course, a much more broadly applicable space than financial payments alone. So this was the inception of the organization, and part of the benefit, and this is part of why DIACC was formed, and the way that we've been able to collaborate in terms of our development for a digital ID framework is by using the digital economy as our focal point. By using the digital economy as the focal point, we've been able to bring together the voices of the public and private sector in one union to work together for the best of Canadians and with the international interoperability as a priority. So that digital economy view has been our strategy to be able to focus together under one story for Canada. Further, in Canada, Canada is a confederation of 13 provinces and territories and federal government, so roughly 14, well, not roughly, exactly 14 entities. And the roots of identity are based in each of the provinces, or if you're an immigrant like myself, they're based in the federal government. So we do not have the ability to have a national identity card for the purposes of digital identity, as we are 14 entities who must cooperate to work together. So with that as our basis, federation is incredibly important for us, not only because it's a priority, but because it has to be, and we have to recognize that as part of our governance. So some of the abilities of being able to work with a small and agile group of 14 entities is that we actually can come together in one room and come to some collaborative approaches for the best of the country moving forward. No, I think some of the differences, I think it's probably fair to say we are a bit of perhaps a halfway mark between North America and fully over to Europe. And we also have ideals and principles that Canadians will not accept anything less in terms of, for example, privacy by design, a user-centric approach, personal data protection, which is built into our regulatory scheme with PIPEDA and personal data protection regulations. So these are values that are already present within our system. Now, what we've done in this, by leveraging this view of the digital economy as our focal point, we've actually taken three particular elements that we find to be critical. This is the verification of a person, the verification of an organization, and the verification of digital relationships. So within that view, we see that the importance of not only representing the person and their actions on behalf of an entity, but actually the verification of an entity. I think, in this morning's plenary Edward Snowden was talking about, we don't necessarily need to identify the person to do a small business transaction. But I know as a user, I certainly would like to know who I'm doing business with regarding the organization on the other side of that equation in the digital economy. So for us, that view has I think is a view that we've taken slightly different from the Americans, perhaps more in line with the approach of the EIDAS, with a representation of the digital economy. The other aspect that I would say is a difference is that within Canada we have the concept of a government authoritative attribute provider. So we do have a concept of reasonable trust within the government to be able to provide verification of particular attributes about a person. And so we're able to leverage that as an ecosystem with public sector and private sector working together to meet the needs of that space. So I think those are some primary differences in how culturally we've worked to address these challenges. And finally, I think, as Jeremy mentioned, the idea of the authentication hub to access federal government services is a concept that has existed in Canada for, I believe, about 5 years now. So we've got a hub that's called Concierge, and it has a blinding model. So the identity provider banks, as well as other identity providers, are on one side, and federal agencies are on the other. There's blinding that happens, so you don't know which identity provider was used, and you don't know which agency it was gone to. So in Canada, I think it's fair to say that we have a degree of familiarity with the identification hub model, and we're actually now moving toward a very exciting space, which is a space to have verified claims and verified attributes be shared with trusted requesters and trusted providers, all with the user at the center of those transactions for consent and personal data protection. So I think very similar trends around the world, but identity is quite cultural. So we are leveraging our cultural specific approaches and our constitutional specific approaches in the solutions that are developing within Canada.
Okay, you mentioned several times EIDAS, data privacy. Would you say that you are taking the EU regulations as a benchmark in your implementation or design?
We are being extremely cognizant of the EU regulations and GDPR, and so in order to interoperate in the economic regional approach and in what is the responsibility for our citizens and residents, we see the EU approach as being something that we must interoperate with, but we also see within our region as personal data protection as something that we must uphold as well. So we think this is actually a positive trend and a very similar trend in terms of empowering users as a user-centric, privacy by design, personal data protection approach. Okay, clear. There is another country which is close to Europe, but not there yet, or not there anymore, which is UK. The difference with UK is the approach as well in implementing digital identity. So Adam, can you tell us more?
Sure, yeah. Less close than we were, perhaps, but I won't go into the whole Brexit thing. We don't have time. But yes, we are very close to Europe in many ways, but different in many others. And the approach we took around identity is quite different. So we don't have an ID card in the UK in much the same way as there isn't in the US, for example. And that's different in contrast to many of our friends in Europe who do have identity cards. So we don't have that basis for identity. There's no intention to either in the UK. I mean, that's completely off the table at the moment, certainly. What we did when we approached building GovUK Verify, which is our national EID scheme now, is in the identity assurance program, we looked at this and we decided, well, one of the first things we need to do is actually make sure that we have a set of principles that define how we move forward with creating this scheme. So we looked to academics and privacy groups to write a set of privacy principles for us that allowed us to understand how we needed to create this identity scheme so we respected the rights of the citizen and that we protected the citizen as much as we do the services. I think what tends to happen is when government schemes are created, they're created with a government set of requirements at the core, and we have those. What we need to know as government services is we need to know that it's really Adam who's trying to make that transaction that's going to take money out as a benefit, perhaps. But we also need to protect our citizens as well. We need to protect them from fraud as well as protecting ourselves from fraud and all these elements. So we built a lot of this into what we do right from the outset. We also decided that we weren't going to be an identity provider, which again is in contrast to many of our friends. So we don't have a government identity provider. We do provide access to some of our data sources because government documents form some of the evidence base for proving who I am, like my passport or my driving license. But they're not the be-all and end-all. There are many other areas that we have to look at. For example, mobile data, mobile operator data is very important. Banking data is very important. There are many, many, many different data sources. I don't know the exact figure, but I've been quoted that if you look across our 7 identity providers and the different approaches they provide, if you're going to register your identity, you can go through over 20,000 different potential routes to proving your identity because of all the different data sources and all the different methods. And that's good in many ways because it allows our identity providers, who are all in the commercial world, to compete and be innovative and provide the best possible solution for a whole range of different people. So that's been good, and that's always been our intention, to have that commercial edge to what we do, which is now being reflected in a lot of work that we're doing to open up the market to allow people to reuse identities and to use our standards for identity elsewhere. Because it's not just about government. We have a finite amount of transactions that are not necessarily as regularly used as others could be. And promoting interoperability of those identities is massively important, certainly for us.
And Adam, what is the rate of adoption of the population, the UK population, about such a system which is basically put in place by driven by the commercial actors? It's not obvious that the people would accept that their identities would be managed by private companies.
Adoption is an interesting thing, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. But at the moment, we have about 1.2 million UK citizens who've got what we call a level 2 identity, which is equivalent to substantial in the European regulation, which is a pretty strong credential plus a pretty strong verification and proofing. And that's appropriate for most of the services that we actually have in government. There are some that need slightly more, which is fine, but most can do most things at that level. Adoption is largely based on how compelling a transaction is. And this again comes back to government not being tremendously compelling usually with the type of transactions we have. I mean, that's just fact. And we can't get away from that. It's not massively compelling for me to get a level 2 identity just to look at my driving license. It's just not. But there are lots of other transactions out there, and some transactions that we've been involved in that are very compelling. So, for example, there's a transaction that we're starting to roll out more widely in the UK around obtaining what we call a blue badge for disabled parking, which for many people who are disabled and need that resource, it's a very important thing. But the current process can take up to 10 weeks. With our online version of that, you can do it in 10 minutes. And that's a massive thing because you don't have to go to an office to get it. You don't have to go through a 10-week process. You can get this thing instantly. And those things are very compelling and they will push uptake. So what we are doing at the moment is looking for transactions in government that are more compelling, but we're also encouraging the commercial world to come up with transactions that are compelling, that use identities that are compatible with our system.
Okay, thanks a lot. I mean, from UK, on the other side of the sea, there is France. And France, as will be described by Alban, is also taking an approach of unified identities, and it will continue thanks to the result of the election. It will survive. And Alban, if you could tell us more about the scheme which is implemented in France, which is quite innovative compared to the historical fragmentation.
Yeah, so the other side of the channel, I mean, most of the country issue ID cards, and so there's already a kind of usage of trust in the state to guarantee identity. So there's very few exemption. I think there's only Denmark that doesn't issue ID card. Otherwise, all the other countries issue or will issue in the near future an ID card. So the situation is a bit different. So I think you said before that identity is cultural, and here, yeah, we see the difference. People are used to the legal framework is present and acknowledge sovereign ID. So the way identity is organized is slightly different. We can see that most in the country have decided to go for an electronic ID cards. France, not yet. Maybe in the near future, we don't know. The newly elected president, seems to be willing to change on this topic. And maybe we will get an electronic ID card in the future. But for the time being, even though we don't have an electronic ID card in France, we do have an electronic ID. So it's called France Connect. And it's a kind of single sign-on platform that actually interconnects all the electronic administration. So the taxes, the health, driver license also administration. And actually the idea is to interconnect all the existing electronic identity authentication factors that do exist to log into your tax account or whatever, so that actually you can use it as a single sign-on factor, so that you authenticate once and you access to all your records. You can perform all your operation using a single authenticator. It has started a few years ago, and now it works quite well. It's gone live, and it allows to reach the level low for the time being, defined by the DIACC regulation. And currently, initiatives are ongoing to offer to citizens at least one authentication factor that is substantial. I will come back on that later. Another one, which is to get the highest level of authentication, which is the level high, which is the highest level defined by DIACC. Now, this platform also offers another service, which is a service for users, which is the sharing of attributes, trusted attributes, which is very convenient. For instance, when a user wants to subscribe or to open an application towards one administration and has to provide proof or attributes or data that are provided by another attribute provider, for instance, the tax agencies. And actually, France Connect aims at setting up a kind of trusted network that will allow transmission and exchange of those attributes from an administration to another one under the explicit consent of the user. So actually, the idea is to protect the attributes so that actually it should not exchange from the user to the administration, because actually the communication between the user and the administration might not be trusted, but actually to exchange it within a closed network which is trusted, and all the exchange will be done under the user supervision. France Connect we still also open to, as I said before, level of authentication with highest level of trust, substantial. So currently there's an identity scheme which is under accreditation by the NSSI, which is called Mobidem, and for which proof and that is already being used, currently being used by Orange, the telco operator. And actually this solution, in which Oberthur participates, allows you to authenticate yourself remotely using your mobile phone by using your identity document that currently are not chip-based, by taking picture of them, checking them on a remote network to check that the document is genuine, check it's not blacklisted, check it all the security features are correct. So this is the first step of authentication, and then checking the document match yourself through a selfie. So indeed, to reach the level 3, the level substantial, lots of checks are performed, liveness detection to make sure that the selfie is a real selfie, that is not a picture that is just copied and sent through the network without any real person behind, to make sure that the document that is pictured and scanned is genuine, that is a live capture also. And this authentication system is being certified to reach a level substantial. It should be deployed by the end of the year, hopefully, in France, and afterwards in other European countries.
Okay, so I mean, this is a very good demonstration that France is moving from what has been a fragmented system to something which is unified, which is consistent with the approach highlighted in Canada, UK, and US, also for having a pragmatic approach of using identities, augmenting identities with attribute, as you mentioned. I mean, and maybe I will bounce on that to explain that. I mean, as I described, I represent here the LuxTrust company, the Luxembourg Trust Services provider, and this approach of having a unified national system has actually been implemented in Luxembourg and is operational for 10 years now. So we do manage the entire digital identity for the entire population of the country. And we see, I mean, in the light of this discussion, that model is being adopted and replicated in other countries, and it all makes sense. And a common pattern that we all see, the five of us here, is really the fact that now augmented or identities or core identities have to be first in line with the applicable regulations, in order to get to the strong authentication that we all need, and to the trust that we all need, and to the trust services, especially signature, that we all need in terms of quality. And also the usage of the identity has to be augmented by attributes to enlarge the usage of them. Now I would like to ask you, I mean, in your respective responsibility, what do you see is the biggest challenge to reach your objective? And Jeremy, I see you asking, what is the top one objective? Is it the commercial one, the top one challenge? Sorry, is it political? Is it commercial, business?
So I'd say it's none of those. It's a simple question, which is whether the government creates an identity scheme or the private sector drives it, or it's something in between. Creating credentials isn't actually that hard. Can you create credentials that people want to use and that online service providers want to accept? I think that's really the challenge. And I think looking, I mean, we've got a great spectrum here of, between the US and Europe and Canada. Still counting you guys in, at least for another couple of years. A lot of different approaches, where are we actually seeing success stories? And also, frankly, what are we learning from the challenges? One of the most interesting programs I've been following over the last few years has been the German national EID scheme, where it's funny, my first day of work in 2011, working for the government, I ended up at a panel at the RSA conference where we were talking about what the US government was looking to do, and Germany was just rolling out its national EID card. And it was a lot of contrast, I would say, in terms of the presentations. The Germans were pointing out how this card had the greatest chip that had ever been embedded in a smart card, and the card substrate itself. The materials were the most advanced the world had ever seen. The encryption algorithms used were unmatched. Very proud of the engineering of the card. 2 years later, the people who were running the program came to visit us just across the street in the Commerce Department and said, we built the greatest card, and yet we were expecting German citizens to be able to log on to all of their online services with it, and nobody's using it. And then I threw out a slogan from one of my favorite T-shirts from a Cloud Identity Summit from several years ago, which nearly made their translator's head explode, which was, ain't no party like a Reliant party. How do you actually get Reliant parties, online service providers, to want to accept it? What's interesting now, so fast forward to about 6 weeks ago, I was in Brussels speaking at an authentication and identity policy forum, and one of the speakers was Kim Wynn, who's from DTrust, who's a certificate authority, and one of the who's behind the German EID card. One of the things he pointed out is what they're finding from Reliant parties is this may be a great card, and it might, handle, be able to account for tens of millions of Germans, but major service providers don't want to integrate with a German standard. They want to integrate with the global standard. And there they were talking about how they're looking at leveraging FIDO Alliance standards to basically do a derived credential from the German EID card that could then be stored in mobile phones. And his point was Google, Facebook, Salesforce, Dropbox, there's a lot of big firms. They've already integrated with this global standard. Can we use this as a bridge to start to extend the functionality of what really is a great national ID card that they've produced, but it's not particularly easy to use or easy to integrate with. And I think focusing in on that particular issue, can we build something that people want to use and that service providers will integrate with? If you do that, as long as you can point to something behind the scenes where there actually is validity to the document, it's something that people want to trust, that's when you're focusing on starting to change things.
Okay. Joni, biggest challenge in Canada?
So, interesting thoughts from Jeremy. I would say that some things that we've learned along the way is to really think about identity in a holistic view, thinking perhaps a bit past credentials as well. The modeling that's coming forward in Canada has been invested, $27 million has been invested by the major financial institutions in particular modeling around attribute sharing network. So moving past the conceptualization of the credential. Credential is still important, of course, but really the ability to share attributes in a network for a particular purpose with privacy, respecting qualities, leveraging qualities of distributed ledger technology to be able to record consent events. So looking past some of these particular lenses around our conceptualizations of identity, I think the other area around trying to really look past the norms that we've become used to is, Adam, you made me think about when you were saying compelling public-private sector digital economy, but you were saying there's only a limited number of transactions that people will do with the government in terms of entitlements and otherwise. And so one lesson that we've learned as well is that people are business owners too. And so when there are many small business owners, and so if we enable people to not only behave as people who are entitled to government services, but to behave as business owners in doing transactions with their government authority around their e-entrepreneurship and their business, it becomes much more compelling for them to interact with the government as well. So thinking past some of the traditional constructs of digital ID and thinking about people as business owners as well, and really moving GDP with the widening of those holistic lenses.
Okay, interesting thoughts. That value for the service providers and value for the users first.
If I could just add a couple of things from my perspective, I think the two big challenges that we have at the moment, and this echoes some of the things that Jeremy said as well, is the first, identity has to be easy to use and easy to understand for the user. And we've talked about, even on this panel today, we've talked about levels of assurance, substantial, high, low. Users don't know what that means. They just have this identity thing. They need to know where they can use it and what it does. It needs to be as easy to understand as pulling a credit card out of my wallet. I know I can pay for stuff with it. I don't have to understand how it works. So I don't need to know the differences between MasterCard and Visa. I just need to know I can use it where I see the logo. It's, that kind of stuff. So we need that. Those are the first big challenge. I think the other thing is interoperability. We're seeing lots of schemes growing up around the world now, and millions of people with electronic identities, but you can't use them everywhere. So that's one of our big pushes at the moment, is looking for international interoperability, not just national, because wouldn't it be great if I could use my UK EID in the US to do stuff and vice versa, or across Europe? And that's kind of one of the things that EIDAS does as well. Not that we've talked about that. And I think the other thing, just talk about the Germany ID system for a moment. It's very interesting that they have 40 million plus cards of great quality cards, very secure, issued to all of their citizens. It's fantastic. It's a real world identity thing. Only just over 1 million of them are actually enabled for EID. Why? Well, largely because you need a card reader and you need to have it plugged into your laptop, and oh hell, it's not easy all of a sudden. So now they're looking at, surprise, surprise, mobile devices and how you can tap the card because it's NFC enabled. It's got all the kit in it, but you're just not using it. So these are the big things we need to look at. It's the whole usability, interoperability piece is massively important for the future of EID. Yeah,
and actually the same happened in Belgium, where nobody is using the ID card. I mean,
but they're really nice cards.
Yeah, they are nice cards, but nobody knows the PIN. So. In France, what is the biggest challenge now, Alban?
From France, there's a lot of challenge. I mean, first of all, France Connect is mainly used for public sector, so I think the maintenance first is to open it to private sector, but as you said before, I think the main challenge is that to make sure that the user want to use it, have a benefit to use it, and that the service provider, relying party, also have benefit in accepting it. And actually, the key things to meet this goal is to make sure that it provides trust to user, it's easy and seamless to integrate for service providers, and it's also easy and seamless to use for the users. And actually, I think you talked about Germany, and I think Germany somehow has shown that if an authentication meeting is not easy to use from the user perspective, and if it's not easy to integrate from the service provider perspective, it doesn't help deploying it. And I think that you mentioned the number of cards that were issued, but the number of cards that are really activated and the number of cards that are really used to perform authentication is really so small. So I think it's really a key point to make sure the authentication mean is easy to use from the user. And if we look at the European perspective and the electronic identity card perspective in Europe, we all see that there's a big move towards mobile phone. All the countries want to move, if not to NFC-enabled identity card to make sure that it's easy to use with a mobile phone. They want to get rid of card readers, they want to get rid of contact reader, because this is not at all easy to use. And all the examples of national ID cards that are contact-based, that need a card reader, have shown to be a failure, not a failure, but not a great success, because really as soon as the user has to plug a card reader to buy it, to manage all the firmware update, it's lethal. It doesn't want to use it. So really usability is key from the user perspective. And last but not least, the trust. The trust is twofold. Trust is to make sure that the private data are secure, are protected, will not be intercepted or catch. So it's making sure that there's a strong privacy shield that is enforced by the state. And the state has a role to play in that game, to make sure and control the acceptor, to control and ensure a minimum security level for the management of personal data, and also trust, making sure that the user is given a mean to authenticate itself towards service provider that provide him with a sufficient legal value, legal protection. So I think this is the challenge that are indeed, from my perspective in France, that are valid, that are at stake currently, but it also at stake in most of European countries. It's really key to make sure that electronic ID and digital ID are widely used in country by citizens and by users.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and indeed in France, even if it's a cultural effect that people need to be reassured about the security of their data, it's also a regulatory environment that needs to be respected. But it seems that there is a convergence about value that needs to be provided to the service provider, value to be upside value that needs to be provided to the users, easy to use system, and interoperability and security and trust are really the key points in making identity systems or national schemes evolving from what they are today to an augmented identity with attributes which could be beneficial for everybody. Interoperability is certainly a key issue because we see here a lot of players acting on identity, and the question would be how making them working together in a few years from now. I think we reached the end. We are reaching the end of the session. Are there questions in the audience to the speakers? Yes.
There's a microphone in the middle.
Andrew Budd, CEO of iProve, we're a biometric authentication business. There's been some discussion about the role of the mobile phone as a platform, on both sides, for the assertion of EID, and typically enabled critically by NFC. Clearly, a large proportion of the market is occupied by Apple, whose NFC readers are blocked for these purposes. From a governmental point of view, what is the nature of your dialogue with Apple, and do you see any prospect of that limitation being relieved for motives of public interest?
I'll answer that from the UK's perspective. As a government, we are talking to Apple. This is important to us. At the moment, yes, they are blocking developers from accessing that particular functionality on the iPhone. I don't think they'll do that indefinitely. I think this is normal business practice for Apple in many ways. They've done this with other functionality. I think we're getting some progress. I think they're certainly very interested in identity. And I'm hopeful that we will get some progress on that in the near future. I mean, I can't comment on when that will be. But you're absolutely right. It is, at the moment, a problem. I know my German colleagues as well from the BSI are working quite hard with Apple from their perspective because, as I mentioned, they are trying to move away from this wonderful card that they've got, which is NFC enabled, but only Android phones can use it at the moment, which is a limitation again, and is going to cause some problems in adoption again. So they're working very hard talking to Apple as well. So yes, countries and states are doing this, and I think ultimately there will be a tipping point where Apple will see the potential, but we have to show them it's not just a case of them doing this for the general good. There has to be a commercial reason why they do it too, and that's one of the things we're trying to work towards.
Another question? Yep.
Hi, my name is Andre. I'm a recent graduate of George Washington University, just down the street. What I really want to ask is, from a government perspective, I would argue that perhaps one of the best benefits that could be provided would be online voting, perhaps because you can do it quicker and faster than it could be today. How many years out do you see that?
In the US, in the US.
Well, anywhere in the world.
Okay. In the US, I would say it's a long way away. And in fact, when I was at NIST, we got a lot of questions about, now that once you get this identity ecosystem thing taken care of, now we can do online voting. And the answer is no. That's just one layer of security. And as I think we've seen in the U.S., this most recent election cycle, and France has had some of it as well. Turns out elections are a really great target, and other countries, have. In fact, I think we've proven that there is very high reward and potentially little risk for trying to do something, whether it's hacking an actual ballot or something else, to intervene. So. My view is in the U.S., I think, given how bad we are at just securing stuff in general, let alone critical infrastructure systems where we're still struggling quite a bit, I think we're quite some time off from actually being able to do it. Just because even if you and I could sit down and architect a secure approach, it wouldn't get implemented well and somebody would break it and then we'd all be anyways. So I'm not too optimistic. Maybe in other countries better than we are.
So just to add a little bit to that, first of all, I do not speak on behalf of the Government of Canada or the Orders of Government of Canada, but what we are talking about is elections of shareholder elections. Part of the role of the DIACC is to experiment and reduce uncertainty, help to learn fast around particular technologies. So shareholder elections are something that we've been talking, that has been discussed as terms of a safer space to experiment. We've also been talking about not necessarily online voting for the population as a whole. Canadians have a high degree of trust in their election process, so we need to make sure that we maintain that integrity. But we are talking about accessibility of voting in particular populations who have accessibility challenges with getting to a place of voting, and populations who are very interested in testing and adopting particular technologies. So in those two areas around shareholder elections and potentially around accessibility are two use cases that we're talking about right now.
And from the European perspective, the EIDAS European regulation is confirming the so-called qualified signature, which has an interoperable and non-repeatable legal value. So that basically the tool that you would need for such an election tool, confirming that the commitment is legal and is endorsed by the people itself. But electronic election has not been considered in Europe yet, to my knowledge. Yeah. There is another question there?
Let me just add on this point. I'm Niall McCann, the Elections Advisor with UNDP. Actually, Estonia is the only country in the world at the moment that has online voting that is facilitated online voting, which they introduced about 3 or 4 election cycles ago. In the last elections in 2015, 31% of Estonians voted online, the majority of which were using their mobile phone as opposed to their laptop with the card reader, with the ID card reader. I think their experience has been they thought this would be a means to encourage young people to participate more. They've actually found it's older people that are participating and using the online voting facilitation more than younger people are. And a couple of things that they've done that is very, very useful, I think, is, first of all, you're allowed to vote online as many times as you want. They just count the last one that has arrived. So they have had cases of people voting 150 times. The period, it's opened up for 7 days prior to the actual election day itself, so you can vote. And then the reason they did that is that because of the great challenge one always faces with voting outside of polling stations. You never can be sure that somebody doesn't have a gun pointed at the person's head telling them to vote in a particular way. So allowing them vote multiple times does at least remove that possibility. They also allow you to cancel your online vote at the end, and if you turn up to the polling station on polling day and vote using a paper ballot, that will invalidate the online vote that was cast prior to that. Again, to give people the opportunity to ultimately know for certain that, on both sides of the equation, that that person is voting unpressurized or unforced in any manner.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting. There is another question there.
Hi there. My name is Jeff from Consensus. We specialize in blockchain tech, and I was wondering what the status is or interest of your organizations are about implementing it, or would you rely on FIDO to set up those schemas? You know, like where are we with that, the nation state level?
Jeff, you won the prize. You said blockchain first, I think, of the whole session, so congratulations. In Canada, we're looking at blockchain and types of blockchain standards as a tool in the toolbox. So we've done a proof of concept enabling corporate registries to an experiment to enable corporate registries to be able to share data, leveraging a Hyperledger standard for the recording of the instantiation of a corporation or the amalgamation, name change, all of the things that are related to corporate identity management. We also have applied research that has been awarded a grant. DIACC has been awarded a grant from the DHS S&T to explore and implement a system which leverages blockchain distributed ledger technology, Hyperledger, to record consent events, in particular identity events. So we're very much looking at blockchain as a tool in the toolbox. Interesting ability to shift paradigms around data management, and we're particularly at this point looking at Hyperledger and more private or permissioned networks where you can verify the nodes or the participants in the network. If you, in the DIACC, IBM are members of our organization, so that's part of why we're looking at Hyperledger. Of course, there are other standards that are evolving as well, so I would say we're looking at it as a tool in the toolbox, recognizing that it will take a village of solutions working together to solve for digital ID solutions.
Maybe two additional elements of answers to that. So one, as LuxTrust as a trust service provider, we are looking at blockchain and we are using blockchain in identity management platform. Basically, that's something that we announced also today with our partner Cambridge Blockchain, which is here in the room. But we are using that for traceability because first and foremost, we have to comply with the EU regulation, which is in place. And today, the EU regulation would not recognize identity managed on the blockchain. Another element to underline is that blockchain technology is getting a lot of traction. Trust is also getting a lot of traction, as confirmed by all the panelists today. So, in Luxembourg, something which was created is a permission blockchain at the level of the country, which is called InfraChain, which is open actually to be a trusted permission blockchain to stimulate the innovation in that domain for all services providers. Consensus or whomever who is interested to know that. Adam, I think you wanted to add something?
Just a couple of points. I'm often asked about where does blockchain sit in relation to identity? And my stock answer to this is, well, nobody really knows what blockchain is. Best description I can give for it is it's a description for a movement rather than an actual technology. So we have a real problem there. This is a real problem where we have to make sure that our relying parties understand what they're getting and that government departments understand what they're getting. So I have a responsibility to do that sitting within government. I think there are also some fundamental issues around its immaturity. So, and this is fine. All technologies have immaturity problems. This is normal. But we have to understand and learn first before we jump into using these things. So I'm always sort of putting the brakes on and saying, well, let's just consider this first. Does it actually add value to what we're doing? Do we need it to replace something that's broken? And generally, I don't think identity is broken at the moment necessarily. So we don't have a burning need necessarily. But that's not to say we shouldn't consider. But there are things like there are no recognised standards for, and let's call it distributed ledger technology because that's a better description. So that's a missing gap in the market. There are some known security issues that need fixing. So let's look at all these areas and make sure that we then have something that we can build national EID systems with. Because maybe we can. And there are perhaps some use cases where it has value. Immutable evidence chains, perhaps for refugees, might be one use case. But so there's an amount of caution I always put on these things that has to be played into the equation and just general understanding of what it is.
Is there any other question? No? So if not, I would like to thank the panelists, Joni, Adam, Alban, and Jeremy for their time and their answers. And thanks a lot for your attendance.
Thank you, Pascal.